Welcome to Tomorrow.Africa, the podcast that explores the possibilities and the potential of Web3 in the African continent. We believe that the future of Africa is bright and that emerging technologies such as blockchain can accelerate its development. We interview people who contribute to this breakthrough in Africa and around the world and who hold a positive vision for the future. My name is Yassi Lokman and I'll be your host for this podcast. In today's episode, we invite you to step into the world of venture capital and explore how it is fueling the blockchain revolution in Africa. We have a special guest, Gideon Greaves, the director of CVVC, the African office of a Swiss venture capital specialized in blockchain use cases. Join us as we venture into the heart of Africa's blockchain ecosystem, where innovative startups are harnessing the power of blockchain to address critical challenges and create transformative solutions. We'll dive into the role of venture capital in shaping the blockchain landscape in Africa, why CVVC has specialized in blockchain, and why it has prioritized the African continent for its investment strategy. We'll explore how Gideon and his team at CVVC Africa are identifying and nurturing blockchain startups that have the potential to drive real change on the continent, the readiness of African countries to leverage blockchain, and what role CVVC plays to nurture the Web3 ecosystem. This discussion was truly enlightening on various fronts, and I'm certain that it will provide you with invaluable insights into types of projects VCs are interested in and why blockchain-based systems are particularly promising for the future of Africa. Gideon, welcome to the show.
Awesome, Yassine. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Gideon, before delving into the topics of blockchain, Africa, and venture capital, could you share with our audience the trajectory that led you to your current position as the director of CVVC Africa? How did your past experiences converge to spark your interest in blockchain and the world of venture capital?
Sure. Yeah, thanks, Yassine. I guess it's an interesting journey. I think anyone's journey to venture capital is usually quite an interesting one. And then anyone's journey to blockchain is also, an interesting thing to talk about. So I think, firstly, my journey into venture capital came from just having sort of, entrepreneurial tendencies growing up. I didn't really fit into the traditional system, to be honest with you. So I wasn't a big fan of school. When I finished school, I wanted to get into the working world and find something that I was passionate about. That led me to being in sales in the digital industry, working for sort of the tech crunch of Africa known as VentureBurn, and their business, which is called Creative Spark, which was acquired by Saatchi and Saatchi at a later stage. So that sort of launched my interest into the world of tech and emerging technologies and how they're applicable in Africa. Working for a news publication covering those topics, and from there I started working in other industries, and eventually started my own business in the food tech space. Started raising capital. At that stage in Africa, the landscape or the market, from a venture capital point of view, was very immature. So it was very difficult to raise capital as an early stage startup. And arguably to this day, it's still very much the same, although it has matured a lot. The maturity of the venture capital landscape is mainly now with those validated growth rounds, so Series A and above. So there's still a lack of access to capital in that early stage environment. But anyway, going back to my journey, the business was called Green Machine. I started to raise money. Everyone said no. Some friends and family said yes. That gave us the opportunity to get going. Started speaking to VCs. That we were just too early. Ended up selling my car and going through that whole journey. But I remember the first time I pitched to a VC firm, before COVID, of course. So, sitting behind a boardroom table in the venture capital firm's office, I just said to myself, I want to be on that side of the table eventually. So very excited to be in the VC landscape. That business ended up getting some venture capital funding and then got acquired later on down the line. by a large organization in South Africa. And I did start. So that's sort of the journey, I guess, to the venture capital, the interest in venture capital. I do have a sort of mind that tends to wonder about many different things from a technology standpoint. I'm very passionate about um, the entrepreneurial journey as well. So I think to focus on just one project for me wasn't as exciting as uh, being more the supporting arm that empowers entrepreneurs with capital and advice to take their startup to the next level. So I really enjoy what I do from that perspective. My blockchain journey came mainly from I suppose my general mindset of wanting to stick it to the man. I was told about Bitcoin probably in 2015. The only reason I never actually invested in it is because it seemed very difficult to own Bitcoin. So I kind of procrastinated and put it off. At the end of 2016, I eventually did invest into the asset, and that took me down a bit of a blockchain rabbit hole to try and understand the technology. From I think to this day, we're still trying to understand it. It moves so incredibly quickly. There's so many use cases and different things popping up in the asset class and in this technology. And long story short, how I got to being at CVVC was, I think, how a lot of people get to be, where they are at a certain organization. I met someone at a barbecue in South Africa. We call it a braai. CVVC is based in Switzerland, and they were looking at expanding into Africa. And they were looking for someone that they trusted and someone that had the right skill set. And thankfully, the stars aligned for me, and I started the African initiative for CVVC in July 2021. So just over two years ago.
So CVVC holds an important place in Switzerland's crypto valleys ecosystem in Zug. Actually, I've been there a few months ago, and I could see the role that it plays there and the importance it had in shaping what this ecosystem is today. Can you tell more about the genesis of CVVC, its evolution, and the place it plays within the Swiss crypto valley ecosystem?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, I tell my story about CVVC in my own way, of course, not being one of the founders myself. But the way that it goes is essentially back in 2016, there was a lot going on in the crypto valley. A lot of foundations and blockchain organizations were looking towards Switzerland to launch their protocol, all their blockchain or crypto business because of a couple of reasons. And one of them was, firstly, Ethereum launched out of the crypto valley or the canton of Zug in Switzerland, which, as we all know, that would have created a lot of noise. A couple of other well-known organizations did the same thing. And I think what was really exciting from that point of view is that there was a very robust and strong regulatory framework that was very friendly to this new unknown asset class and technology that attracted a lot of these founders to set up in that canton, besides all the other obvious reasons around Switzerland and tax and so on. So Matthias Ruck, who's one of the founders of CVVC, was based in the region and was noticing all these things in the Web3 realm happening around him and couldn't ignore wanting to get involved. And they started a business back then called Lakeside Partners, which was focused mainly on doing these startup pitching competitions and hackathons and conferences and networking events and so on. And eventually that morphed into a venture capital business because Matthias and the rest of the CVVC team were having so much access to these projects. They witnessed a lot of rubbish, as you can imagine, at that early stage of this technology. But they also saw a lot of startups that were utilizing this technology to transform, stagnant industries and so on. So that's really sort of the birth of CVVC. What it is today is essentially two things. One is CVVC, which is an acronym, of course, of Crypto Valley Venture Capital. CVVC is an investment company We invest off various funds, and we also invest off the balance sheet. But CVVC owns another business called CV Labs. And for us, CV Labs has come to be our secret sauce in the space. We're not just a traditional VC where we allocate capital and sit on your board or give you quarterly advice. We get our hands pretty dirty. We have an acceleration program out of CV Labs. We help our portfolio companies raise capital. Our ecosystem business, what we like to call it, CV Labs, also has a co-working space. So you can think of it as like the WeWork of blockchain. We've got a space in Switzerland, which is of course the first space that we launched. There's 130 tenants out of that building. It's a 4-story building. We've got the likes of Cardano, the CEO Fred, he sits out of there. Tezos has got an entire floor. We've got co-working spaces in Cape Town, in South Africa, in Liechtenstein, in Lisbon in Portugal, and then in Berlin in Germany as well. And then we do research and reports with various partners within the ecosystem, even legacy corporates like PwC and Standard Bank. But we also work with a lot of protocols and blockchain organizations like Certic and Luca and Lisk and Polygon and Cardano. And then we do a lot of events. Like the business started, we do a lot of pitching competitions and hackathons. And from that point of view, it's quite exciting because we get to work with the legacy world, which is important to us because it allows us to bridge that gap between Web 2 and Web 3 and accelerate adoption in the space. So we've done hackathons with universities. We've done hackathons with protocols like Near Protocol and Polygon. And we also do some advisory work. So whether that's for various governments in Africa, we do some advisory work for some of the governments here, or it's for different startups wanting to take their business to the next level, or in my case, penetrate the African market. And the nice thing about CV Labs for us as a venture capital firm is that all the different initiatives that we do, these events like having an event once a year during the World Economic Forum in Davos, having that conference that we do every year in Switzerland, we now have one in Africa. It paints the picture of us being a thought leader in the space, which gives us access to the best deal flow in the market, especially in the markets that we active in. What it also does for our portfolio companies is it allows them to get integrated into a global ecosystem, and it acts as a platform where they can succeed and grow and make relationships with the right people to take them from 0 to 1 as quickly as possible. And that's where we are today. We've got a global fund, which is fully deployed. They're raising capital for their second fund now. And then we have an African fund, which is deploying and raising capital at the same time. We have 8 portfolio companies so far. The core sort of countries that we see a lot of deal flow and strong use cases is Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. So your typical countries. The one we'd love to see more deal flow from is Egypt. But I think because they have quite a intense regulatory environment there, effectively crypto being illegal, I think that stifled the ecosystem. And then we do have we have 2 portfolio companies outside of those 3 countries that I mentioned. We have one in Ghana and one in Egypt.
Does CVVC exclusively focus on blockchain startups, or are there instances where you've ventured into non-blockchain territories? And if so, if you've only focused on blockchain startups, what is the rationale behind this decision?
Yeah, so we do only focus on startups that utilize blockchain. I think how we differ to some other crypto firms is that we focus exclusively on very strong use cases, and we focus on utility more so than speculation, which means that sometimes we do miss out on those hyped up projects where there's very early liquidity and you're able to get a 20x, 30x, 50x return in months or a couple of years. So ours is more of a traditional venture capital private equity fund of 8 to 10 years, where we're looking for more sustainable growth and stronger use cases. So most of the time we're investing in equity on the back of that. And I think the reason that we only focus on blockchain, to answer your question, is that it's the technology that we understand as a firm. We also believe that it's transformational in terms of some of the industries that it can disrupt. And And I guess that's our niche in the market. As a new VC and as an emerging manager, it is relatively difficult to come into the market and just say, we invest in tech. So for us, we focus on what we know, which is blockchain, which is creating an ecosystem, and we focus on strong use cases. We focus on utility. We don't invest in, speculative pitch decks with tokens that don't really do anything. We've seen a lot of those in the past couple of years. Sometimes because of that, by some of the other crypto firms, we get regarded as a bit of a more sort of boring player in the space. But when the market dips like it has in recent months, it proves to be a very solid and sustainable business model for us. We're in it for the long haul, and we believe in what the technology can do. I think there's still a long way for this technology to go. We see that there's a big gap in education from the legacy world and the Web 2 world. I think everyone has a broader understanding. Not everyone, but I think some of the key players globally do understand the basic applications of blockchain, but aren't necessarily pursuing it because there isn't a pool of talent that's able to execute on bridging that gap, I guess, between Web 2 and Web 3 quickly enough.
You've talked about a belief that you have as an entity on how blockchain can be transformative for different use cases that it facilitates. It seems to be the same thing for the African continents. So it seems like you've also put an emphasis on investing in the African continent. So could you share the story behind the foundation of CVVC Africa? And again, the rationale for creating a separate entity focused on the African continent.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And you can imagine as a European organization that hadn't yet branched out of their country, I mean, there was a global fund, right? They didn't decide to do a Southeast Asia fund or Latin America fund or Indian fund, but what they decided to do was to actually do an African fund. And that really stems from our thesis that the developed markets focus a lot on the speculative side of the crypto economy, where we see that Africa is teaching the rest of the world about the true use cases. So that's the one point on why we entered the continent. The other one is that generally, if you look at what's happening in Africa, it's a continent that has the perfect recipe to adopt this technology and leapfrog into blockchain. Some of the data that we like to talk about is the average age of Africans, which is 19. It's the youngest continent in the world, the second youngest, depending on the data you look at, the second youngest continent is South America or Asia, where the average age there is 31. So you can see the massive difference there. And the rate at which the Africans are coming online is faster than anywhere else in the world. And as you can imagine, from an African that's never had the opportunity to interact on the internet or to have connectivity, the first time that they're doing this is through a mobile phone. So that's already showing you the leapfrogging opportunities in Africa and what type of market it is. So we believe that it's going to be a very, very digital market in the next couple of years. The other thing is that generally from the developed markets, Africa is starting to be looked at as a serious contender when it comes to investing into emerging markets. What we've seen is that there's a lot of international capital flowing into the continent. So you've seen the likes of Sequoia Capital and A16Z, SoftBank, Tiger Global, some of the crypto firms like Pantera and Paradigm and Coinbase Ventures, all deploying capital into Africa for the first time. But they're investing into validated growth rounds, as I mentioned earlier, Series A and above. They don't have boots on the ground, and they don't necessarily have a good understanding of the market, even though they see the opportunity. So they're mitigating their risk by investing in rounds that are, where the startup has completely proven their product market fit and they've got solid traction. So Series A and above, as I mentioned. Now that leaves limited access to capital in that early stage environment. So you have startups that are passionate about what they're doing. They can see the opportunity in the use cases that they're working on. However, because they don't have a lot of traction and there isn't a lot of capital in that early stage environment, they're forced to bootstrap a lot longer. And from an investment perspective, that gives us the opportunity to invest in a Series A startup at a pre-seed, seed stage evaluation. And you can see this from some of the startups that have gone through our accelerator from Africa. They would have done I won't mention the names of these startups, but some of them have done $100,000 in revenue. This is when they're entering the accelerator. The one startup I'm thinking of had 17 employees. The other one had 9. They've got a lot of traction. They've got revenue. They've got significant technology built. Now you compare that to the European counterparts, where it's mainly 2 or 3 founders, no employees. They've got a pitch deck. They've got a bit of an MVP, and that's it. So that's really interesting from an investment perspective for any VCs, whether you're in blockchain or not. And I think finally, the other one is that there's a lot of opportunity in Africa to invest in people. And at the end of the day, being an early stage investor, that's something that we all look to, is investing in people. At the end of the day, everyone has ideas, right? It's more about backing the right jockey or the right founder that can persist and persevere and navigate his way through the tough times, can raise capital, etc. And there's a cool report from the African Development Bank that shows that 22% of working age Africans own their own business. So that gives Africa the highest entrepreneurship rate in the world. And what that means for us is that you're investing in the right type of people and the right founders. The reason why this stat is so high is that these Africans don't have a plan B. In Switzerland, for example, if you lose your job, the government will fund you up to 12,000 francs a month. They will support you, and you'll meet with someone once a month until you get another job. If you lose your job in an African country, it's obviously a very different story. So these founders in Africa are forced to innovate. They're forced to look at the market in a way where they can, in our case, use blockchain to solve very unique problems to emerging markets like Africa. And also what this does to the mindset of the founder is it creates the feeling of, as Steve Jobs used to say, they become emotionally attached to their business. They view their business or their product as an extension of themselves. And that's the best type of people or founders to invest in, where it's a do or die attitude, and they just, they'll go to the ends of the earth of making it work. Of course, I'm generalizing, but we see that more so here than in other parts of the world. So those are some of the reasons why we've come to Africa. The logic of separating the funds for Africa is that it is a different type of investment product. And originally, when the African Initiative was launched, there wasn't actually the view to have a separate fund. It was more that I was going to be on the ground here to drive various initiatives and look for deal flow. But we started getting so much deal flow here, and we started noticing all the things that I mentioned to you, that we decided if we invested from the global fund, 30% of the portfolio is going to end up being from Africa. So we need to start diversifying and creating a separate fund. We're also giving the opportunity for LPs and investors from developed markets that are looking into specific opportunities in emerging markets to invest into our fund. Where I think if they invested in the global perspective, it becomes saturated in almost a different thesis. Like, as I mentioned, there's almost that arbitrage opportunity in Africa because founders are forced to bootstrap longer. So the more we started understanding the African market, the more we saw that these products, because at the end of the day, venture capital firm is essentially a financial product, right? They started becoming more and more different, and the narratives and the way that we sell these to LPs became more and more different. So we had to actually separate them. And so we launched the African fund. And as I mentioned earlier, we now have 8 portfolio companies in that fund so far.
Some argue that Africa is not necessarily ready to adopt blockchain on a large scale, despite the fact that the population is young and despite the fact that there is a need for it. especially with regards to understanding the technology beyond cryptocurrencies and speculation, and also talent availability and legal frameworks in African countries. As an entity mainly driven by return on investment, how do you evaluate these aspects in various African countries before deciding to enter a country and making investments in these countries?
So I think when we evaluate from a very objective, broad standpoint, when we evaluate any business, we do it. We sort of follow the normal recipe that other VCs do, and then there's certain aspects from an African point of view that we do look at. So some of them that we look at is we try and look for at least one of four things, and this also depends on whether it's going to be a direct investment. And our direct investments are usually startups raising capital for their pre-seed or seed rounds. Otherwise, we also invest into startups that go through an accelerator, which is a standard model of $135,000 for 7%. And effectively, what we're trying to look for is experienced team. So they don't have to have all of these things, but at least one, a very experienced team, revenue, users. So whether it's merchants or it's users on the platform, or depending on their product or their service, or significant technology built. So, I mean, let me put it to you this way: if Elon Musk pitches a business to us, we probably won't even have to look at the pitch deck. We would just know that this is a founder that we would want to back. So that ticks the box of an experienced founder. If the startup has got a significant revenue, then we know that they've validated their product. And similarly, if they have users or merchants on their platform, they might not have started to monetize them yet, but they've at least validated their model in knowing that there's a lot of people utilizing the product. And then finally, sometimes there are opportunities for us where we would just take a punt on the technology that's been built because we believe that it's very transformative, but it hasn't actually been launched into the market yet because they need more funding to build the technology to get to a point where where they can launch it. I do agree with what you're saying that there is a possibility that Africa could be too early, and I always make the joke in saying that CVC Africa is either going to be one of the pioneers in accelerating adoption of Web3 in Africa and creating this ecosystem and being one of the sort of founding fathers of creating this ecosystem, or we too early. Those are the two options for us. We of course believe, that we're going to be one of the pioneers in the space. And the use cases are very different. So even if we were a token investor, we don't get many opportunities to invest in token projects in Africa. It's mainly equity projects because it's a lot of infrastructure that we're investing in. The use cases are different. If we see a token project, they're usually working on a global use case, and they're not doing it as well as some of the other global startups that have access to a lot more funding and are closer to an ecosystem like New York, San Francisco, or Singapore, where they can scale and exchange ideas and raise capital with the right people. It's difficult doing that from Africa. Of course, sometimes you'll have one or two African founders and the rest of the teams in other parts of the world, which is different. But if it's a truly African business that's inspired by global use cases, but very, very Africa-based when it comes to their operations, usually they can't compete. So we're looking at use cases that are solving African problems. They're based in Africa. Of course, there are exceptions to the rule with our thesis, but that's the core thesis, and that's what we're looking for. Mainly, we see a lot of fintech solutions. So, I mean, we've got a deal flow warehouse where we're looking at various startups that we're looking at deploying capital into. There's 3 identity startups in there. There's probably about 10 startups that are working on borderless remittances and payments. So I think there's a lot of use cases that are being worked on by multiple startups. So for us, it's really about trying to find the entrepreneurs that we believe are going to successfully do it in the best, beat their competitors essentially. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does CVC Africa contribute to the growth of this Web3 entrepreneurial ecosystem? That would be important for the technology to scale, to be adopted for real use cases to be used by the populations. So you, for example, mentioned that you organize events, that you also have co-working spaces. Do you have other initiatives that you've launched to nurture this ecosystem?
So we're working on multiple initiatives now that should be rolled out in 2024. Some with government organizations. I mean, I'm not at liberty to mention who they are yet because it hasn't come through, but and then multiple corporate organizations as well, legacy corporates, banks, etc., that we're partnering up with to develop programs where the startups that get incubated and accelerated through these programs have the opportunity to work with the corporates, to build co-pilots with them, to have them as their first clients, etc. So that's some of the things that we're working towards. We've done hackathons, as I mentioned, with universities. So we putting, for example, in that instance, we're putting university students in the mindset of honing in on blockchain technology and coming up with a use case in terms of what can be solved in South Africa and Africa from that specific example. So I think we try and do a lot of initiatives around education as best as we can with the limited resources that we have. And as I said earlier, they include those startup pitching competitions. They include meeting up with corporates. They include the research and reports that we do. So we wrote the African blockchain report in partnership with Standard Bank. We do a lot of events. So those events can range from being, your stereotypical conference to being more of an educational event. We're planning a hackathon now with one of the bigger protocols where, unlike a normal hackathon, there's a layer before the hackathon that focuses on educating developers on how to build on this particular coding language. And I think outside of that, we put a lot of effort into trying to meet with the legacy and corporate world to try and change their mindsets and get them to understand why they need to start looking into blockchain and Web3 and how it can transform their business internally. And as you can imagine, there's so much red tape and bureaucracy in government offices and in corporates just because of the size and nature of how these organizations are built. So it takes a long time to penetrate these companies and to speak to the right people. But I think we're doing a pretty good job, and we're starting to see a bit of a snowball effect. And I think when the market turns, a lot of these organizations will be looking to start adopting blockchain and the various use cases. What I can also see in the industry is that you see a lot of Steve Wozniaks, if I can make that example, that are the entrepreneurs driving a lot of these applications. And what I mean by that is that the Steve Wozniaks are the sort of nerds, so to speak, in the industry that are the first ones to adopt the technology and actually be able to develop a blockchain application. But they don't necessarily have the commercial mindset to take it to the next level, the Steve Jobs mindset. So what we're starting to see now is a lot of, as the industry gets more mature, we're seeing a lot of Steve Jobs types of entrepreneurs partnering up with the Steve Wozniaks, which is allowing applications to be a lot more sustainable, more have a better UX and UI to actually be used properly, and they're commercially viable. I mean, a lot of these products are pretty daunting from someone at home to interact with, connecting MetaMask wallets and that sort of thing. So I think there's still a long way to go for it to become simplified. And that's some of the things that we're trying to do, is we're trying to just simplify it, and we focus on educating the industry and the legacy world and the Web2 world on the basic use cases. And the basic use cases are actually the ones that are more applicable for an emerging market like Africa versus a developed market. I can give you some examples as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Given the unique socioeconomic context of Africa, are there specific applications of blockchain that you're particularly interested in or see immense potential for?
Yeah, so there's a big sort of ecosystem on applications that promote financial inclusion, banking the unbanked, cross-border payments fits into that, democratizing financial access. So there's a lot. So fintech solutions is by far the biggest one, and I think globally, with blockchain, I think that's generally one of the use cases that I looked at. But I think in developed markets, there's a lot of dodgy DeFi protocols, and everything's driven on the back of wealth creation. Where I think in Africa, it's more just about access to a financial infrastructure that's been missing and that blockchain can solve. So on a more basic level, some of the stuff that we see, for example, is like international remittance. So utilizing blockchain rails to remit capital throughout Africa. The average cost of remittance in Africa is 9%. I think in Nigeria, sometimes I get this statistic wrong, but I think in Nigeria it's 17% to send cash into Nigeria, which is insane. In places like Zimbabwe, it's cost 40% to send money out of Zimbabwe. So we've invested in a startup called Mazuma that does this pretty well. Mobile money and international remittance utilizing blockchain rails. They can do it for essentially 1%. So that's a great example. Another one outside of fintech is just generally there's a lot of use cases around verification in Africa that can be utilized. And a great example is a startup that we invested in Nigeria called Africa, and they verify property on chain. So essentially, they're putting the title deeds on a decentralized database. Now, back in the day when Bitcoin launched and everyone started talking about what potential use cases there could be on the back of this technology, a lot of professors would speak about property verification, but no one was really pioneering this use case because in developed markets they don't have that problem, right? In Nigeria, 60% of court cases are attributed to land disputes, and it happened to the founder of this business. He put down $18,000 for a property. He put down $18,000 deposit for a property that wasn't actually his, and he lost the money. So in Nigeria, if you drive around Nigeria, there's signs in Nigeria that say this property is not for sale. So on the back of being able to verify these title deeds, they've been able to create a marketplace now that only advertises property and land that has been verified. And going back to my point earlier, if you look at markets like the US or Japan, for example, it's not on their priority list to change the property registration protocols. They don't need to put title deeds on a decentralized database because they don't have that problem. However, at some stage, everybody is going to have to update their technology from writing letters to email, and hopefully at that stage, Africa will be 5 years ahead of some of the developed markets because we would have leapfrogged to this technology, and we'll be able to actually export this property verification system to developed markets, which eventually will adopt it because it's just better than having that centralized. So we see a lot of use cases like that. What I'm hoping to see more use cases of is trying to combat fraud and corruption. But unfortunately, those sort of use cases need a lot of buy-in from the corporate world, and in particular government. So I've met with startups that on the most basic level are verifying university certificates. They're verifying vaccines. So for example, never mind COVID, but if you travel into Kenya, you have to get a yellow fever vaccine. I've got my yellow fever vaccine twice now. You only need it once in your life because I lost that little yellow card. And if you, first of all, digitizing it would be great. But second of all, to digitize something like a vaccine, it needs to still be verified. So that's where also these identity protocols come into fruition. But also these identity protocols still need to have endorsement from governments to be able to successfully roll out their applications. So I'm hoping for more of these applications to come out. In Africa, 25% of the GDP of the continent is lost to corruption, and most of this corruption is attributed to poor tender and procurement processes. So this is just an example of an application that we would love to see. If you got an application that was endorsed by the government, first of all, and was able to verify all the tenders that went out there, who was awarded the tender, what they did with the money, because at the end of the day, it's our money that they're spending. It's the people's money that they're spending. And we know that a lot of these tender processes are extremely dodgy and corrupt. And if you were able to put all these transactions on chain, then you could track and trace exactly who was spending the money and why. and it would eradicate fraud. So long term, you can completely eradicate fraud on the continent. And imagine just 10% of that 25% ended up being eradicated in the next 5 years. It would completely transform the continent. If that went into promoting entrepreneurship and basic, UN, UN goals, for example, it would completely transform the continent. So that's another thing why blockchain is very interesting for emerging markets. However, as I mentioned, those use cases do need the blessing and endorsement of governments, which is why we're trying to educate them on utilizing blockchain.
Beyond investment, do you also provide mentorship to startups?
Yeah, we do. I mean, anyone that comes into our portfolio, of course, by default, they get that. We meet them as frequently as we can. We did a startup pitching competition last week or 2 weeks ago with Certic, which is the largest smart contract auditing firm. And the winners of the competition, in fact, even the participants that didn't win, have got free consulting hours with us. Generally in the market, we try to, as best as we can, guide people in the right direction. So yes, we do it commercially and for free, depending on the circumstances. So we have it very loosely as one of the services that we offer. However, it's not really advertised on any of the platforms that speak to CB Labs or CBVC, but we do get those opportunities sometimes. Otherwise, with the various initiatives that we do, we've got another one coming up now with the Innovation Summit in South Africa at the end of September, where there's a blockchain challenge, and with the applicants and the startups that are entered into this program, we will be doing some mentorship for them as well. So we definitely do that as best as we can when we can.
You've mentioned that CVVC has published a few months ago, or this year, the 2023 edition of the African Blockchain Report. I found it personally to be very insightful, as it sheds light on the state of blockchain technology and investments across the continent. In this year's edition, could you share a few takeaways about the global investment seen in blockchain startups?
So I think what we like to do is just give context as to what we're talking about in the report, which is why we first talk about what the landscape is generally from a global perspective outside of blockchain, so general venture funding. And the last report that we did was covering data between 2021 and 2022. And what we saw there was, from a general venture funding perspective globally, startup funding had dropped by 30%. In Africa, startup funding went up by 34%. Of course, Africa is coming from a lower base, but it's still fantastic to see that we're still on the up. And there's a great statistic that shows how long it took $1 billion to be invested into Africa. Per calendar year into startups on the African continent. And in 2020, it took 11 months to hit that $1 billion mark. In 2021, it took 8 months. And then in 2022, it only took 7 weeks to hit that $1 billion mark. As we hit the economic downturn towards the end of the year, that did start plateauing. However, the market, as I said, was still up 34% in Africa. And then if you look at now honing in on blockchain, globally, the market was up 4%. So these are, capital that's being invested into blockchain startups specifically was up 4%. And then in Africa, the market was up by a whopping 429% from funding into blockchain startups. So there's definitely a lot of focus on Africa and the use cases. And in fact, a lot of the protocols that we're starting to speak to now, in terms of what the data, covered in the report, Yassine, that you were talking about, it covers a lot of the use cases. And a lot of the protocols that we're speaking to now in this bear market are becoming more interested in Africa because of the use cases here, and because they're a lot stronger. A lot of these protocols, these layer 1, layer 2 protocols are giving out grant, or have been giving out grants, or making investments into various applications, blockchain applications. But a lot of them are losing their investments or their grant money because they're not successfully taking it to the next step. And in Africa, because they're working on stronger use cases, there's a lot of interest now in the startups in Africa that are utilizing this technology. From a regulation perspective, however, that did not paint a very good picture from an African point of view. There's still a lot of regulatory uncertainty around blockchain, but I think it follows the path that we always see Africa follow, where it follows the developed markets. And we saw the exact same picture a couple of years ago in developed markets. So I don't think it's anything to be scared of. I think governments, as they start to understand it, they will start adopting it. We were speaking to a government recently in East Africa, to their Reserve Bank, and they weren't against crypto or blockchain at all, which was interesting to see. They were actually opening their door to us and really excited to engage. They just admitted that there is a big knowledge gap for them to start, putting regulatory protocols in place for this type of asset class. They still need to understand it a little bit more. So sometimes it's actually a relatively basic conversation. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of red tape and bureaucracy to get that to come right. But sometimes it's quite a basic conversation, and you can see it's just human beings that don't have a good understanding of this. But we're hoping that even with all that, the nice thing to look at from those statistics is, even though that the regulatory environment in Africa is really, really poor from a blockchain perspective, there was still so much growth. So you can imagine once the regulatory environment changes, you can imagine what sort of growth there might be. When the landscape's a bit different, and also when we go into a bull market. So I think with the bull market hopefully coming up soon, as well as changes in regulation in Africa, we could see a big surge into deep tech like blockchain into Africa.
The report also identifies key African nations making significant strides in the Web3 entrepreneurial ecosystem, so namely Kenya, Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. What do you think are the common factors contributing to their success in blockchain innovation compared to other African countries?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if you just go back to countries that have the highest GDPs and generally have solid tech ecosystems, first of all, that's definitely a contributing factor. Regulation can stunt that ecosystem. However, like I mentioned earlier with Egypt should be one of the leaders in the space just because they are already one of the top 4 in Africa when it comes to general tech. They're not in blockchain, which is going to leave them, trying to play catch up once they start figuring out that they need to be looking more closely at this. So that's why Egypt is not working. The 3 core countries that we're seeing opportunity are South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria. Nigeria arguably doesn't have the right landscape to promote and quickly grow an ecosystem. And the reason I say that is it's very difficult to get collaboration from all the key actors and players that comprises of an ecosystem in Nigeria. Meaning it's hard to get universities, policymakers, large corporates, investors, and startups all to sit together in the same room to for a common cause and to build an ecosystem. That being said, what Nigeria does have right is the entrepreneurs and the founders there are definitely working on the most pertinent use cases. First of all, it's a massive country, so the market is huge. And I think the entrepreneurs there really understand the problems in the market, and they're able to put together a solution that matches with blockchain. So the majority of the deal flow that we see, funny enough, is coming from Nigeria. The reason why we haven't launched an office there is because we do want to have a broader ecosystem approach. So we definitely will be launching an office there. But from an ecosystem perspective, we see that the 2 strongest nations in Africa is Kenya and South Africa, where the environment there lends with trying to create a thriving ecosystem, where you're able to speak to telecoms and banks and consumer brands from the legacy world that are open to doing projects together, where the policymakers and the governments are keen to collaborate, universities, etc. So I think Kenya and South Africa definitely are the 2 places where you can create an ecosystem, so to speak, in this new technology. I think that the strongest use cases, though, are coming from Kenya and Nigeria. I think South Africa gets a lot of influence from the developed markets. So we do see a lot of founders pitching global ideas to us. And to put it in a basic term, if someone from South Africa pitches the next Instagram or Facebook to us, it's not something that we're really interested in, right? We're looking at more the African use cases. And if it's a global use case, it's going to be very, very difficult. Of course, there's exceptions to these rules, but it will be very, very difficult for you to compete on an international landscape, being based out of Africa, working on a global use case.
Given your position at CVVC Africa, Gideon, you have a unique perspective on Africa's relationship with emerging technologies and particularly blockchain. What is your personal vision for the future of the African continent within the context of Web3? How do you envision these technologies impacting the socioeconomic development of Africa and altering its position on the global stage?
Yeah, man. I mean, I think this technology really has the power to transform Africa. I just hope that we get the buy-in of the large corporates that have a lot of pull with regards to the policies that are being made, and of course governments themselves. As you can imagine, some governments out there don't want this technology to be rolled out in the way that we would like it to, because they're corrupt. So we have to almost align ourselves with the opposing parties and to tell them to start utilizing blockchain as part of their campaign, to say, if we come into power, we will implement this technology and its various protocols to eradicate fraud and to eradicate corruption. So I think one of my sort of visions for Africa and blockchain is that fraud and corruption is completely abolished, so that Africa has the best chance to thrive and succeed. The second one is that there's basic access to financial infrastructure for everyone across the continent. So financial inclusion and everyone being able to transact, and banking the unbanked. So those are the two core opportunities that I see blockchain solving. There's many, many more, but I think if those two can be solved, the market will expand exceptionally, and it'll just be a more prosperous place to live and transact as well. We'll get a lot of more foreign investment coming into the continent. And I think the blockchain has the opportunity to do that across the world. So it's going to be very interesting to see how it gets adopted and who are going to be the leaders in the space and who are going to fall out of the space. As the market matures, a lot of the hype over time will start to die down. So it's going to be interesting to see who sticks around and who are the big protocols and applications that are going to make a difference and really grow this technology and get more adoption into the space.
And also, when you see how the technology is adopted today in developed countries, it mostly remains at the speculation level. While in the African continent, there is a real need for it. So as you've been saying, because the systems are lacking or because they're corrupt, blockchain can actually serve as the infrastructure upon which new systems can be built that would inherit the characteristics of blockchain that are resilient to the problems that we encounter in the African countries.
Exactly.
So yeah, great. There is actually a growing number of entrepreneurs eager to leverage blockchain technology to drive change and impact developments in Africa. There's actually a hype around the technology, and I don't see it as a bad thing. It's actually a good thing because it's justified, to my opinion. So, as someone deeply ingrained in these fields, what advice would you offer them? Are there any particular best practices or common hurdles or key areas of focus you'd like them to consider as they navigate this journey?
Yeah, I think, just sticking to basics outside of blockchain is the good one. Like, try and get as much traction as possible. Get your product or your MVP. If you're a startup founder in the space, get your product out there, even if it's bootstrapped and it's on a spreadsheet. Just get something out there. Try and validate that there is a market that wants this. Try and align yourself with the broader ecosystem. I think sometimes the Web3 community in general there's almost like an arrogance in Web3 where they just run on their own. They're never going to make it like that. There needs to be collaboration with the old world. So I think trying to form partnerships with credible institutions from the old world, if you can call it that, I think is a great opportunity and something that needs to be looked at. And then general, if you're a crypto enthusiast and you want to learn more about the space, just go to as many events as possible. It is quite a small community. Everyone is very enthusiastic. It's a really great community, I think, globally. Try and get to physical events where you can interact with people. You get to learn. I mean, watching YouTube videos and reading is one thing, and listening to podcasts is one thing, but actually being there and meeting people and hearing different perspectives and different opinions and seeing different startups and meeting thought leaders in the space is definitely going to excite you and increase your general understanding and knowledge of the space and how it can be applied to the real world. So those are some of the things I guess that I would suggest.
For the listeners who have been inspired by this conversation and that would like to stay updated with the activities, the investments, and insights of CVVC, are there any specific platforms, events, or publications they should tune into?
Follow CV Labs on LinkedIn and on X or Twitter, and you'll see all the different things that we're up to. We have an event once a year in Africa that will probably move around the continent, but for now it's in Cape Town. We did the first one in May this year. In 2024, we'll do it probably a little bit earlier, either in March or April, CV Summit Africa. And then from a global standpoint, CVVC Global or the Swiss team, they have a conference they've been doing since 2016 in Switzerland, in Zug. It's on the 3rd and 4th of October this year, the CV Summit. We also do an event once a year during the World Economic Forum in Davos, which is really cool to attend. But I think if you want to connect with us, we're all pretty approachable and relatively quick to respond, depending on the platform that you reach out to. I mean, there's so many these days, right? So I think if you reach out to us on Twitter or X or LinkedIn, we're happy to connect with anyone that wants to learn more about the space and has a passion for crypto.
Awesome. Gideon, was great talking to you. I'm very happy that I was able to have you on the podcast, and thank you for the insights that you have shared. And I would love to stay in touch.
Thanks, Yassine. It was awesome to be here. Hopefully we'll chat again soon.
I hope you enjoyed this episode. Feel free to visit our website, Tomorrow.Africa, and subscribe to our channels to be updated about the future episodes. We publish 2 episodes per month at the 1st and 15th of each month, so stay tuned for the next ones. And until then, stay curious, stay ambitious, and see you tomorrow.